Welcome to Single Malt History with Gareth Russell, pouring out your serving of pure, distilled, intoxicating, and occasionally delicious history. After he was swept overboard from the sinking Titanic, Alabama-born historian and ex-military man Colonel Archibald Gracie IV had been pulled from the water onto the overturned lifeboat he had been struggling to free for other passengers just before the Titanic entered her death throes. Like many passengers in the time that elapsed between the sinking and their rescue, the Colonel grappled with questions of faith as existential spirituality mixed with more immediate terrestrial agony. Gracie was a Christian whose faith had both grieved and comforted him 9 years earlier when his 12-year-old daughter Constance had been killed in an elevator accident while the family were vacationing in Paris. Of his time on the boat with other men, some of whom were former first-class passengers like he had been, one of whom was a wireless operator who had likewise jumped overboard at the end, others were officers or men from the boiler rooms. Colonel Gracie left a particularly moving account which I'd like to share here with you. Actor Pier Evangelista read some of Colonel Gracie's testimony in yesterday's episode about the sinking, and I'm delighted he's returned to read the Colonel's words about the aftermath.
During all these struggles, I had been uttering silent prayers for deliverance. It occurred to me that this was the occasion, above all others, that we should join in an appeal to the Almighty as our last and only hope in life. But it remained for one of these crewmen, who I had unjustly regarded as uncouth, a Roman Catholic seaman, to take precedence by suggesting aloud the thought in the heart of every one of us on that boat. He was an arm's length ahead of me in the boat. He first made inquiry as to the religion of each of us and found Episcopalians, Roman Catholics, and Presbyterians. The suggestion that we should say the Lord's Prayer together met with instant approval, and our voices with one accord burst forth in repeating that great appeal to the Creator and Preserver of all mankind, and the only prayer that every one of us knew and could unite in, thereby manifesting that we were all sons of God and brothers to each other, whatever our sphere in life or creed might be.
Later in the night, Gracie was transferred to a more stable lifeboat where a female survivor gave him a rug to throw over his knees. He shared it with Algernon Barkworth, a British landowner who had also been in first class and who had also survived after leaping overboard from the sinking Titanic. When they reached the side of the Carpathia that morning, there were those so battered from exposure in the lifeboats that they physically couldn't wrap their hands around the rope ladder thrown over the Carpathia's side. Those now invalided had to be placed in a sling and winched up, a terrifying journey as the hull rose alongside them and the turbulent, deadly sea, chock full of towering icebergs, sloshed below them. When they reached the deck of the Carpathia, they encountered crowds of fellow survivors, anxiously scanning the faces of each new arrival from each new lifeboat to see if their loved ones were there. For every cry of joy, there were two of despair as it became clear that the 712 survivors had roughly been outnumbered 2-1 by the recently dead. Some clung to rumours that the Carpathia was not the only rescue ship, so there might be survivors loved and safe on the White Star Line ship Baltic, the most popular candidate in the rumour mill as another source of safety. But those hopes were brutally, if necessarily, laid to rest by the Titanic's senior surviving officer, Charles Lightoller, and by her only surviving wireless operator, Harold Bride, who both confirmed that the Baltic had been too far away when the distress calls went out. The same was true of the Olympic and the Virginian and any other ship that passengers heard whispers of. The only ship to reach them that morning was the Carpathia. The only survivors from the greatest shipwreck in recorded history thus far were therefore standing on her decks or huddled in her rooms. An Irish lady who had been travelling in third class refused the offer of a bed because her back was in such agony from her escape that the only physical comfort she could find was to lie on the hard wooden boards of the deck. An Italian mother began screaming that her child had vanished, sobbing with relief, when it turned out the Carpathia's crew had taken him to the hot press to try to warm him up. A British mother, now a widow, had a clump of her hair missing, her scalp still bleeding from when her hair had been torn out as it was caught in a lifeboat oarlock. Jane Herman, a second-class passenger emigrating to New Jersey, was identified as a suicide risk when she realised that her husband and their de facto adoptive son George had not survived the sinking. Likewise identified was Mathilde Weiss, a Belgian passenger in second class, also emigrating in her case to Canada, whose husband had drowned. They had not even been planning to travel on the Titanic until their original booking was cancelled because of the coal miners' strike, and the passengers re-diverted to the Titanic. A third bereaved second-class survivor, Dagmar Brill, a Swedish subject, said she wanted to die when the roll call on the Carpathia confirmed to her that her fiancé Ingvar had drowned, as had her brother Kurt. Sobbing questions and screaming came from lips cracked, some bleeding from exposure to the salt-laced night air. Walking around the Carpathia's deck in defiant agony was 21-year-old Richard Norris Williams, a tennis champion en route to start his studies at Harvard that autumn. Only a few hours earlier, Richard had seen his father Charles crushed to death as one of the Titanic's funnels collapsed on top of him. The fur coat Richard had grabbed from their first-class cabin had kept him warm in his top half, but the Carpathia's doctors told him that his legs were so damaged by frostbite that they would both need to be amputated. Begging to be given at least a chance to prove them wrong, Richard hobbled in excruciating pain across the Carpathia, eventually changing the doctor's mind. He later went on to be a tennis champion at Harvard and as an adult at the Davis Cup, later taking gold for tennis at the 1924 Paris Olympics. One of those who had not suffered a family bereavement was second-class passenger Kate Boss. She sat down to write a letter to her family back home in England, assuring them that all was well, or as well as could be. Her words from that letter are read for us by Joanne Doody, and in them, Kate reflects back to the church service she had attended on the Titanic on her last morning afloat.
Before you get this, you will have heard of the awful experience I have had. Sunday morning, we paced around the deck with the vicar of St. Jude's and his wife. After luncheon, she insisted on me having a good rest in her husband's deck chair, as I looked so tired. That lady was such a splendid character. And now, she is gone. We had a very short morning church service given by the purser, but no sermon. Strange to say, after that, although we didn't quite realise it, every prayer and hymn seemed to be preparing us for that awful experience a few hours later. I shall never forget the splendid lives that were lost, and I'm grieving now, much more for them than for myself.
Kate Boss's reflection hit the nail on the head for those few women who had been travelling alone or with other women on the Titanic. Kate had noted in one of her earlier letters, which Joanne read for us in episode 2 of this podcast series on the Titanic, that she had been the subject for good-natured teasing in second class because it was still so unusual for women to travel in 1912 without a male companion. Now, although she had lost her trousseau and all of her wedding gifts which had been stored in her luggage, Kate was not mourning somebody she loved. Her fiancé Sam was still waiting for her, safe in America. The Countess of Rothes and her husband's socialite cousin Gladys Cherry also quietly, if sincerely, expressed to one another frequently their profound gratitude that they hadn't been travelling with any of their male relatives. Although Gladys was so haunted by nightmares that she had to ask the Carpathia's onboard doctor to sedate her at night so that she could sleep, during the day she and the Countess took to volunteering to help the other survivors who were mourning the loss of a loved one. Gladys accompanied the doctor on his rounds, while the Countess, who had trained as a nurse with the Red Cross during her spare time, set to work with the third-class passengers. It was through this that the Countess of Rothes met a fellow survivor, who she would subsequently refuse to leave until that woman was reunited with her church family in New York. Rhoda Abbott had refused to leave her 16-year-old son Rossmore when crew insisted he was an adult male, and on those grounds denied him a place in the lifeboats. You may remember that particular story if you listen to the previous episode about the sinking itself. She had still been standing on the Titanic's decks, worrying with Rossmore and his 11-year-old brother Eugene when the Titanic entered her final plunge. Clutching their hands together as a family unit, all three were swept overboard. But in the underwater suction and terror, they were pulled apart. Only Rhoda survived. Both of her sons had drowned. The Countess of Rothes was so devastated by what had happened to Rhoda Abbott that decades later, her grandson was able to recall just how deeply the Abbott deaths had continued to haunt her for years. The generosity of the Carpathia's passengers and crew to the Titanic refugees was faultless. They cleared out of their cabins, donated their clothes, began fundraising to help the immigrant survivors. 40 years later, Bertha Watt, who was then 12 years old and a survivor from the Titanic's second-class cabins, told a historian that from their example on the Carpathia, I learned a great deal of the fundamentals I have built a happy life on, such as faith, hope, and charity. The Titanic's crew went back to work caring for survivors, while the wounded Harold Bride offered to help the wireless operators of the Carpathia work through the backlog of telegrams as survivors anxiously tried to contact their families on land. But it certainly wasn't all edifying. Alfred Nerney, the Dutch car salesman pretending to be a German aristocrat, tried to hog blankets intended for other survivors. He even tried to turn a pile of the blankets into a comfortable mattress for himself. And when a fellow survivor asked him to move so she could get a blanket, and he refused, she pushed him off onto the floor, shouting, "To think of it, the likes of you saved and women left to drown? Shame on you." Bystanders in the smoking room, now a dorm for survivors, cheered as a shameful, if not quite sufficiently shamed, Nerney beetled away. Attitudes to those men who had survived became increasingly bitter. This in part explains the birthing point of the long-lasting lie that some of the men must have dressed as women to sneak into the lifeboats as the Titanic sank. For men who had jumped, the opprobrium was stayed. Colonel Gracie, Algernon Barkworth, the frostbitten Richard Norris Williams, and 17-year-old Jack Thayer were regarded as heroes. But those who had lived not because they jumped, but maybe because they had been allowed into the lifeboats by officers early in the evacuation, found themselves accosted on the Carpathia's decks by grieving widows asking in pain and rage why they had lived while their husband had not. When an American surgeon who had escaped in the lifeboats tried to explain himself to Renee Harris, now a Broadway producer's widow, she replied, "I wouldn't have my husband back at the cost of a woman's life." The deteriorating weather added to the panic, the misery, and the anxiety. A thunderstorm engulfed the Carpathia the day after the rescue, terrifying some of the survivors, while the heavy fog that arrived the day after that further slowed their arrival in New York. The fog, in its turn, gave way to a heavy rain which pelted the Carpathia as she finally passed the Statue of Liberty. As the New York piers, Ocean Liner Row, or Liner Row as they were sometimes nicknamed, came into view, the Titanic survivors began to appreciate, to realise that their own grief would no longer remain private. Tens of thousands of New Yorkers were lining the piers. A journalist tried to jump on board the Carpathia from a small riverboat, hoping to get an exclusive interview with the survivors, even if only by a few minutes from his rival newspapers. That is how in demand the story and testimonies were. The Carpathia steamed slowly to Pier number 59, one of the White Star Line piers, where the Titanic had been due to arrive. There, slowly and eerily, the Carpathia lowered the Titanic's empty lifeboats, returning White Star Line property to its owners, They were briefly stored, and then almost certainly every single one of them was destroyed by the company as a cross between a dread omen and an unwelcome reminder. The Carpathia then went to Pier 54, a Cunard pier, where the survivors and the Carpathia were illuminated by the flashing bulbs belonging to hundreds of press photographers. Through the rain, the camera flashes also shone a light on the 35 ambulances donated to greet the Titanic wounded from every private hospital in Manhattan. The ambulances were parked next to limousines and cars donated by Vanderbilts and Rothschilds and New York Society's great families to drive survivors anywhere they wanted in the state. The mayor and the police commissioner were on the pier, ready to keep back the crowd of 30,000 spectators. The United States Commissioner for Immigration had coordinated with the Secretary for Commerce and Labour to waive the immigration processing for the Titanic survivors, who would bypass Ellis Island and the red tape. On the Carpathia, one emigrant whose possessions were now on the bottom of the Atlantic said, "I have nothing in the world, and I have no place to go since my husband is lost, but I am not afraid. I have always heard that the Americans are the kindest people in the world. I am sure they will take good care of us." White Star Line officials stood by to provide train tickets to carry third-class survivors to any point in America or Canada. And for those whose dreams of a new life had gone down with the Titanic, they would provide ocean liner tickets to take them home to their families in Europe. As the gangplanks were lowered to Pier 54 and the passengers and crew disembarked, to the cries of relatives and spectators, the queries of journalists and the camera flash of photographers, they also moved from a time of private mourning, shock and discombobulation into one of the first great mass-covered media events of the modern era, and a tragedy that would, with rapid forward cultural momentum, move further and further away from what they remembered into a legend, a lesson, and 1,000 warnings. The 20th century would adopt and adapt the Titanic as one of its great myths, a potent piece of didacticism. But for the 712 survivors, it would remain something that haunted them, shattered their families and their mental well-being, shaped their lives by day, and by night turned their dreams, too frequently, into nightmares. In our final episode on the Titanic Anniversary Week posts that we've been doing, I'll be exploring the lives of those who survived, including the passengers and crew whose testimonies we've heard read aloud by actors this week. And for that final episode, I'll also be joined by the wonderful author Julie Cook to discuss her research into what the Titanic did to working class families caught up in its tragic wake. Out of respect for the National Day of Mourning for Prince Philip's funeral tomorrow, and also so that we coincide with the day the Carpathia actually reached New York, I'll be posting that final anniversary post on Sunday the 18th. I'd also like to take the time here to thank Joanne, Doody and Pier Evangelista for their time and talent in returning to read the words of Kate Buss and Colonel Archibald Gracie, as well as to express my gratitude to you for your time in listening to this. Take care. Don't forget to follow and share this post if you've enjoyed it and don't mind doing that. And I really hope that you and yours have a safe and happy weekend. Thank you.